Welcome to this week's episode of Reading the Gospels Through Hebrew Eyes. Well, friends, we have a challenge on our hands this week. The reading is from Luke chapter 16. It's typically called the parable of the unjust steward, and it's almost universally recognized by scholars as the most difficult of the parables to interpret, and probably by preachers, one of the most difficult of the parables to preach. So, needless to say, with that kind of reputation, I am by no means going to declare to you that I'm going to deliver to you the definitive interpretation of this parable. There's a lot of different directions that you can go, and part of the challenge is knowing where the parable ends, and for me anyway, a major part of the challenge also is seeing how the various teachings about possessions that follow the parable, how they intersect with the parable itself. I mean, are they, as it were, an extrapolation, a teaching drawn from the parable, or are they simply a collection of kind of wisdom kind of sayings that are connected with wealth that Luke appends to the end of the parable? And then you also have the issue of the commendation of this dishonest steward. How does that jibe with other teachings about Jesus concerning wealth? So, needless to say, we have a few questions that we need to answer as we work our way through this. But maybe, hopefully, by the end, we'll at least have a pretty good understanding of the overall thrust of this parable, which, as I'm going to argue, is all about the steward when he faces an immediate threat and judgment, an uncertain future, throws himself upon the mercy of the master. So, without further ado, let's get going with the first two verses. Luke 16, 1 and 2. Jesus also said to his disciples, "There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was wasting his possessions. And he called him and said to him, 'What is this that I hear about you? Turn in the account of your management, for you can no longer be manager.'" Now, the first thing I want to talk about is the contextual nature of this. So, as I mentioned before, of course, in the original text, there were no chapters, there were no verses. The text just ran on. Now, we tend to make these separations in our mind. Okay, we just finished Luke 15, and now we're going to look at Luke 16, and we almost unconsciously assume that we're looking at an entirely new section. Not necessarily so. There are some connections between Luke 15 and Luke 16. And Luke 15 is all about the parables of the lost coin, and the lost sheep, and the lost son, or the prodigal son. Now notice how Luke 15 and 16, those parables and this parable actually tie together thematically. Number one, at the beginning of Luke 16, there is no mention of a parable. Now, a parable is told, but we're not told that Jesus spoke in a parable. But if you go back to Luke 15:3, which is introduction to the three lost parables, you do have that word parable used there. So it's as if you hear the parables in Luke 15, and then there's one more that's joined to those parables. Also, in verse 16, chapter 16, verse 1, we read, "And Jesus also said," implying that what he's saying here is somehow connected with what went before. Also, notice this theme. In both the story of the prodigal son and this story of this steward, this manager, they cast themselves upon the mercy of a superior. Of course, the son cast himself upon the mercy of his father. And here, the steward or the servant, the manager, is going to cast himself upon the mercy of the master. And in both of these, they receive that mercy. And the one verbal link between these two. So the verb diascorpizo occurs in chapter 15, verse 13, and then chapter 16, verse 1. In 15, it's describing the squandering of the prodigal son. He went to the faraway country and he squandered his wealth. He diascorpizo his wealth. And here, the manager is accused of diascorpizo, of wasting his manager's possessions. So that verb ties these two together. Now, let's also look at a couple of different features of the language that's used here, and we'll see how that also is going to connect with other parts of the Gospels. First of all, the manager is told that he is to apodidomi, to turn in the account of his stewardship. Now, interestingly, that's also the verb used in rendering an account in the kind of the eschatological, the end time sense in Matthew 12 and Hebrews 13 and in 1 Peter 4. So this is like an eschatological moment for this steward as he is to give an account or turn in an account, apodidomi, of what he's been doing. Also, as we just mentioned, there is this verb diascarpizo. So this is the verb for wasting his master's possession, the same verb used for the squandering of the prodigal son. Now, we don't know exactly what he did to waste his master's possessions. I mean, was this a misappropriation of funds? Did he simply neglect his duties? Was he perhaps charging an exorbitant interest? Whatever it was certainly serious enough to get him fired. So this steward or this manager, he's kind of like an estate manager, and he's probably collecting rents for his boss. And he is, when he's accused, he's summarily fired. So this is what you might call a kairos moment for him. He has to decide, what am I going to do in this situation that I find myself in? I'm out of work now, and I have an uncertain future. So what am I going to do in order to assure that I actually have a future? What are my options, and then what option am I going to focus in on? Well, that's what we'll find out in the next section. So we read in verses 3 and 4 this soliloquy. This is just this self-speech that's about to occur. So after the manager tells him, basically, you're fired, he says to himself, what shall I do since my master is taking the management away from me? I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. And then it's kind of like you have this brief moment where he thinks some more, and then the verse continues, I've decided what to do, so that when I am removed from management, people may receive me into their houses. So this self-speech, this soliloquy, this is not the only parable where this occurs. There's a couple of other examples of this. So again, referring back to Luke 15, the prior chapter, that's exactly what the prodigal son does when he's in the faraway country and he's feeding pigs. When he came to himself, he said in this soliloquy, how many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread? And I'm starving to death here. So he says, I'm going to go to my father. And then he has this speech that he's prepared he's going to say to his father. So he's talking to himself. He's engaging in a soliloquy. Same also in Luke chapter 12, the barn builder. This rich guy who has so much that he thought to himself, what shall I do? I have nowhere to put my crops. And then he continues his speech by saying, well, I know what I'll do. I'll just build bigger barns, right? And then he even has a third saying, a third soliloquy. Then I'll say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. So this kind of soliloquy is not by any means isolated to this parable. It's a common parabolic feature. Now, notice a couple of different things that he says here that I think are worthy of attention. First of all, he says, I am not strong enough to dig. The Greek verb there for dig is skopto, but it can also mean to hoe. So you hoe ground, you're chopping weeds, or you're digging around. It can also mean to till the ground by hand. If you go to the Septuagint of Isaiah 5:6, it's used there in the sense of hoe. This is probably just kind of a proverbial saying. Basically, the steward is saying, well, that one option is not going to work because I'm too weak to get a job that requires hard physical labor. So that option's out. And then, of course, he says he's too ashamed to beg. And then also at the very end, he says, I came up with a plan so that people may receive me into their houses. Now, that's important because that's going to intersect with verse 9, where Jesus says, I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth or mammon, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings. We're going to get to the meaning of that verse in a minute, but I want you to pay attention to how that connects with what Jesus is going to say in a moment. So, got the whole scenario set up here. He says, you know what? I have the idea. I know what I'm going to do. Well, what does he do? That's what we find out in verses 5 through 7. So, summoning his master's debtors, one by one, he said to the first, how much do you owe my master? He said, 100 measures of oil. He said to him, take your bill and sit down quickly and write 50. And then he said to another, how much do you owe? He said, 100 measures of wheat. He said to him, take your bill and write 80. Now notice the word I have underlined, quickly. That is very easy to miss here, but I think it's very significant too. So the steward knows that he must act rapidly. Why? Because he's been fired, but he still has the books. He still has the receipts. He still has these slips of paper that tell how much each one owes. And so before it's too late, before the judgment actually falls on him, while he still has time, he acts with haste. He acts quickly. So we got several questions that we need to deal with here. So number one is this. Has the word got out into the community that he has been fired? Well, evidently, no, it has not, because he's able to summon these. He probably uses messengers to summon each of these people that owe or are going to owe money to his masters. And if word had got out, they would certainly not have been cooperating with this steward. They have no idea that he's been fired. They think this is all a legitimate reduction of what they are going to owe. So right now, it seems as if there's only two people who know what's happened, the steward and his boss. The community does not know yet. Okay? Next question. How much was of the oil debt, this olive oil, of course, how much of that was forgiven? Well, the measure here in Greek is a batos. And estimates vary here, but probably we're looking at a significant amount, 800 to 900 gallons of olive oil that were owed by this guy. So this is cut in half. He reduces it from 100 to 50 measures of olive oil. So in value, most scholars estimate this was a reduction from around 1,000 denarii to 500. Well, if a denarius was a day's wage, we're looking here at what? About 3 years' wages that were owed. That's cut in half from 1,000 to 500. Thirdly, how much of the wheat debt was forgiven? Well, here the measurement is a core. It's a dry measurement. It's a Hebrew dry measure for grain, flour, etc. So this is between 10 and 12 bushels, a core was. Now, this was a huge amount of wheat. It represented about the yield of 100 acres, which is a lot of acres back then, a debt from between 2,500 to 3,000 denarii. So another significant payment that had to be made. And this was reduced from 100 to 80. And then finally, the fourth question, and really the most important question. What was the gamble of the steward? So what is he banking on? What might happen? Well, when he reduces these amounts, of course, the master can just simply come back and say, that was dishonest. I never approved those reductions. We need to change them back to what they were before. That's one option, certainly, that could happen. It could also be that the steward, in engaging in further dishonesty, and further wasting diaskarpidzo of his master's goods, he could be jailed. He wasn't jailed to begin with, he was just fired. But having done this, he could face even a stricter punishment than what he was already going to endure. What is he really banking on? He's banking on the fact that when these tenants had these reductions of rate and word begins to get out, the master is going to be seen as generous, as gracious, as merciful, as giving. And it is that gracious, giving, merciful character of the master that the steward is banking on. And as it turns out, that's exactly the right thing for him to bank on, because we have here a merciful master who realizes that in doing what he's done, the steward has actually made the master look good. And the master is then seen as merciful and gracious and giving and compassionate. And so he, in this kairos moment, in this moment of judgment, in this moment of uncertain future, he banked on the mercy of the master. And as it turns out, as we'll just see, it turned out well for him. So, verses 8 and 9. The master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth or mammon, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings. Now we're going to talk about some of the language here and what that means in just a second. First, I want to point out that this is where there's some uncertainty, depending on which commentary you read, which scholar you consult. They all have kind of different ideas as to where exactly the parable ends. So here are the three main options. Number one, it could end at verse 7, where he says, take your bill and write 80. End of parable. And then the rest of this would simply be an explanation of what it means. Could also be ending with verse 8a, where he says, take your bill and write 80. The master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. So the master here would be understood as the master for whom the steward was working. Sometimes you'll see people extended the parable all the way into verse 8b, the last part of verse 8, where it would end with the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. In my own case, I think it ends with verse 8a. This master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. Okay, now let's talk about some details here that hopefully are going to kind of pull all of this together with the meaning of the parable and its application to all of us. First of all, this master language in Greek is kurios, which is the same word that's in other places translated as capital L Lord or lowercase Lord. Sometimes you'll read people who say the kurios refers to Jesus, that Jesus was commending the unfaithful, the unrighteous steward. I think it makes more sense to see this as the master in the parable itself. He is the one who is commending this dishonest manager. And as far as commending goes, epaineo is the verb there. And that is in some cases translated as praise. So he praised him or he commended him, however you want to translate it. He spoke positively of what this steward had done. Why? Because, we go on to read, he acted shrewdly, which in Greek is phronimos, and that's the adverb. It's close to the noun form phronimos, which can be translated wisely. In fact, if you go back to the Septuagint, you'll see that phronimos is often used to translate the Hebrew word chokmah, which means wisdom. So one of the commentators, Marshall, says, shrewdness is a word which is often used of the attitude which disciples should adopt in regard to the coming of the Son of Man. The steward had seen the urgency of the situation and reacted sensibly towards it. So too, it is implied, should men react to the impending judgment of God. Now, one more thing here. This sons of the world being shrewder than the sons of light. So the steward here represents a son of this age. And he's held up as a model of wisdom, not dishonesty. So it's not his dishonesty that's being praised here. It's his shrewdness. It's his wisdom. So this is a classic Jewish rabbinic argument from the greater to the lesser, known as kol vachomer. It's from a minor to a major premise. Basically, so if such and such is true, so if a lesser thing is true, then how much more is this other greater thing truer? So if this fellow, who's facing judgment and an uncertain future, threw himself upon the mercy of his master and was later received into the homes of those friends, how much more, there's your argument from lesser to greater, how much more ought you to act with greater wisdom? What should you do? Well, throw yourselves upon the mercy of God. Act wisely even with worldly goods by not putting your trust in them, so that when all is said and done, you too will have an eternal dwelling. And then finally, who is the they that might receive you into eternal dwellings? Well, three different options. And I'm going to go with number one here. The angels. So angels will receive you into eternal dwellings. And angels very often will act as a different way of speaking about God, a circumlocution for God. Could be the personified alms, so the gifts that are given, they receive you into the eternal dwellings. That doesn't make much sense to me. And number three, the recipients of the alms, so those to whom you were generous, they will greet you in eternal dwellings. So the overall thrust of this seems to me, and again, I'm by no means dogmatic in this interpretation. I think there's several different directions we could go with this, but the overall thrust of it seems to me to be this. This steward was in the same situation on a much lower level that all of us are on. So we're in this kairos moment. We're looking at the future. We're looking at the eschaton. We're looking at judgment. We're looking at standing before the master, right? Well, what are we going to do? What are we going to count on as the means of ensuring that we have a future? Well, in this case, in the parable, he counted on the mercy of his master. He acted wisely in doing so. And the merciful master commended him. Well, what do we do when we face the judgment of God, when we face the judge of the living and the dead? What can we do? Well, there's only really one option. If we are to act wisely, shrewdly, we will throw ourselves upon his mercy, the mercy of our master. Because as it turns out, our judge has nail marks in his hands. Our judge is the one who was willing to die for us. Our judge is the very incarnation of mercy. So we throw ourselves upon the mercy of Jesus Christ. When we're facing the judgment of God, there's only one place to go: to God, the judge, who is also our Redeemer, our Savior, our brother, the one who loves us and calls us his own. So it seems to me that's the best way to take this parable, that is teaching us by means of this argument from lesser to greater, that if the sons of this world know that when they're in this moment of crisis to throw themselves upon the mercy of the master, then how much more we, the sons of light, should know to act wisely and to throw ourselves upon the mercy of our master. And not to put our trust in worldly possessions, but instead to be gracious, to treat them with wisdom, to give them to our friends, to be those who are not governed by our possessions, not ruled by them, and certainly not putting our trust in them, but instead, as we who have received mercy, we also show mercy, and we are generous and gracious and properly use the possessions that God has given to us. So that ends that section. Now, there are, depending on the reading, 3 or 5 more verses that follow this, so let's go look quickly at those. So this is verses 10 through 15. One who is faithful in a very little is also faithful in much, and one who is dishonest in a very little is also dishonest in much. If then you have not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches? And if you have not been faithful in that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? No servant can serve 2 masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. The Pharisees, who were lovers of money, heard all these things, and they ridiculed him. And he said to them, You are those who justify yourselves before men, but God knows your hearts. For what is exalted among men is an abomination in the sight of God. Now, what it seems to me is happening in these last 3 to 5 verses is you have various teachings of Jesus about possessions, the proper use of them, comparisons made between properly using them and being given greater gifts, greater responsibilities. And they are pulled together by, in this case, Luke the evangelist, and placed after this parable is told, in order that you might have actually a whole collection of wisdom sayings here about wealth. And not every one of them is simply a truth that's drawn from the parable itself, but rather, since the parable includes a teaching about the proper use of possessions, this seemed like a good place for Luke to place all of these other teachings about wealth as well. So there's 3 to 5 sermons that are built in just to those concluding verses with regard to discipleship and the use of possessions, all of which basically communicate the same truth, that our trust is to be in the Lord and not in mammon, that our justification is in the Lord, and we're not to be justifying ourselves, that properly oriented discipleship is that which trusts in the Lord and does not put trust in worldly possessions, but rather uses them as good stewards of the gifts that God has given to us. And that is this week's reading. Hopefully, in this difficult parable, you have a little bit better understanding of what our Lord is teaching us, what our Lord is communicating about the need for us, when we think about judgment, to throw ourselves upon the mercy of the one with wounds, all of which speak to his grace and his mercy toward us. Thanks for watching. Hope that you're all doing well, and we'll see you next week.